Morning, Yeshe. Good morning, Katrina.
Oh, yeah, that is. Can't get to sing it. So, net out. I'm just pumping shirt. I'm be sure it turns out I could tell us Chasalo. Oh, yeah. Takasur. Oh, that's him. Jet I'm jacket and trip from Gangera. Can say you and then couldn't you keep shit on you are star. Take you do. Tambe Chusen, Yambe Chanju, Rambuch set and the December shoes. Oh, yeah.
So here, to begin with, thinking about one who is able to benefit all sentient beings, one who has eliminated all faults and attained all good qualities, one should set such a motivation of bodhicitta, wishing to attain that state for the benefit of sentient beings.
Oh, this is not getting Sravasti, Kindimba number Yangelia. Not to tell you, this shiny.
So good morning and hello to everyone there at Sravasti Abbey, as well as to all others who are listening to these teachings.
Well, the show done the Sumba. Tami to be Shirap Tanzini Nimbur Miteba Sudwa. The Tami to be Shirap the Tanzini Nimbu Miteba, la Sumche subject Kajandua. Oh, Tinakara. Zindan gave us some Nimbur Merose. Numuchan Mari Pala, Zigda Geshe, member Subas. Tami to be Shirap Tinin Zindan gave a Nimbur Tembas. Subject Sum Duata, Tina Netambo. Zindan gave us some Nimbur Miruat Redua. Oh, Tati, one subject related to Yungura, the Shekam Washe. Tatambo. Zindan gave us some Nimbur Miruat Teredua. Zindan gave us some Yenoche Yena. Tanzingi Never Jula, Chadaya Penjinto, Never Juro, Shenas, Kajik Dabakudua. Tami to be shirap that Tanzania called Zindang, you gave us some Tami to be shirap the Tanzila New Yonasigora, Tending Mares. Zindang gave us some Chichilla Nuchil and Yurgi Yonasigora, and Chagdani Budiasa, the Chata, Kondu Yusora. Chagdani called Yulia, Shanji Chagbatera, but the Kondu de Damachi at the Tinia called Zindang Mitumba Redua, the Kondu, the Salan, the Shagi Chagdal New Meduasa. Zindan gave us some Yinda Young Mares, or the Kaji should debate, teach Lapsana, debate.
No. So here we are picking up, this is 521 in the Tibetan for anyone following there, and page 420 in the English. So here we're at the point of disposing of the idea that the wisdom realizing no self is unacceptable as an antidote to self-grasping. So here this is divided into these various topics. We don't need to go into too much detail as they'll be explained below. The first is the unsuitability as an antidote of the mere opposite of the mode to the mode of apprehension that is self-grasping, and then proving that defiled ignorance is not substantially different from this view of the self and the perishable, and showing that the wisdom realizing no self is the antidote through its opposition to the mode of apprehension. So here we have some that say, as the opponent does, that if the mode of apprehension that is self-grasping is destroyed merely by its opposite, then self-grasping will also destroy its opposite, as attachment and anger destroy one another. So here, merely having sort of different or, as it says, opposite modes of grasping is not sufficient to say that one thing can undermine another. So although we can have like anger, where it has this aspect of aversion, and its opposite is this sort of attitude of attachment, grasping at something, although those have different sorts of aspects, they don't have the ability to undermine each other. It doesn't work that way. So the opponent thinks that attachment and anger destroy one another, and then we will respond to that.
Oh, the Chata Kondo, Pension Zindan Tadeba, some Yinayase, Zindan Yidi Mitumba Yina Rakagare. Nuja Mayan Bartas, Konichi Chilia Nugumares, Vora, Nuja Mayan Barta, Karesna, the Chata Kondo Niga. Now, Yambe thousands in Balatene, Kuchene, Tingu Juchene, I gave a Sumbares, Vora. San Kokurani Niga Yomore Dora Chichil Noyake Yomare. Dadun Zimbe Kuchi Toble Keba Chiani to Tsumbe Shirtanse. Tini Moji Gudan Drebung over Uveshes. Doshada Kontoniga de Tangzing, something I Udabachil New Chakshin Yobacha, Telenovachidon, Konto Gora. Jack Tangzingi, Chadaniga. Moji Gudan Drebung over Yoshe, Tangzingi, Moji and Teletan Kevin Drebung over the Esgora. Oh, that's how I thought Yamdola Chanel. Tangzin Juji Changi doesn't, Doshada Kontonibude, Tadun Zimbe Juchi Latani Kevin Yamoy, but Chiba de Sicily New Madesora. Gudan Drebung over Cherise, Kansaka Tangzingi Juchi and Te Drebuliani, the Chagwadan, Chagwachi Teletani, the Yulan Country King Goddess, Gudan Drebung over Cher. Dosha Contro Pension to Tadana Newman, Dosha Contro, Pension Zinda. Chidigi Yidu Waton, Chagbe uses Chidigi Yidu Mewaton, Troy in a meeting by Yina, Chichil New Made, Songdua, Zawati, or Tichuna.
So here, then, the response to that comes from Thabkhe, where he says that although attachment and anger are merely mutually differing modes of apprehension, it follows that they are not related as destroyer and destroyed. So here, although we can see that there are sort of different aspects, they don't accord with each other. It's anger and attachment are quite different in that way. It doesn't follow that they act as destroyer and destroyed, because they equally have a nature so as to arise by the power of a single cause, self-grasping, and because those two are direct cause and direct result. So here, both our anger and attachment are afflictive emotions that arise through this single cause of grasping at a self. So when you have this kind of self-grasping, and then something is doing harm to that, you're going to give rise to anger. If there's something that you view as pleasant, you're going to view that with attachment and give rise to attachment. So although we see that there are mutually different modes of apprehension, it's different to perceive something as harmful and give rise to anger than it is to perceive something as beneficial or desirable and give rise to attachment. But they both have the same cause, that is this fundamentally grasping at a self. And since those two are direct cause and result, there's not any way that they can be mutually destroying in this kind of way. So here, to read the root verses for that, it says, although attachment and anger are mutually differing, they do not destroy each other because they have a single cause, self-grasping, and they are related as direct cause and result.
Oh, yeah. Tadini Ralu Sidwana, Kaji Sulapidwa. Semi Shi Combaso, Nimbo Shaya Yoba Mai Namse. Doshada Kondo Tozulia, Nimbotelia, Tamito Beshira Mainge, Roane, Chambadan, Chawadan, Tanyumla Sobo, and the Nimbo Shanda Yomar Vesivara, Lucy Shanda Yomar Vesina, Roa. Semi Shiso, Chambat Semi, Yuzi Semi, Kawa Semi, Tanyu Semi Yordo, Simje Tamje. Simje Kandeji Tong in a teleminity to me that Trena, Simje Kandeji Tong in a teleane, Karsura Tawadan Dena, some raw, and then Simje Kandeji Tona, Niri Chadam, maybe Tanula Nena, some Simje Kandeji Yaji Chodona Telekawa Comgurno, Namju Tong, some Jiti Comgus, Semishi, Chambacho Comgus Sungua. But then Semi Shilla Soba Combaso, Yembusha Yuba Mainam Shena. Chitangarazo Namju Kondo Nimbula Chamba Conguara Kondo Sabuyana Chamba Congurese and it was Shaya and Kondo Sasonati Nimbula Saba Congurese Kondo Nimbulia Chambada and it's Sabata to New Yora. Oh, Tana Shane, the Shah Nimbutala Miduba Combase Ko Chagbe Italy and then told you that you and then my Bajan Samatani Chagaman Churutayagi. Oh, today, Nishi Shanda, Negab, Tanda, when you are Pamabso and Dalla Tamida, today Tomatuna, Kadulpa, Mabso and Dalimu, you are Raulia. No Chesa Nibu Shanda, you are Marbakera, Tamito, we should have Tanya, Tanzidan Zudan gave it Tamito, we should have Terra Shake to us and Asiguara. Oh, did you? Oh, didn't go under so. Semi Sila so Semi Sikomba so Nebusha, Yoba my nams, or the Marbes to Twitter, so I teach you na. The large.
So then here, the opponent comes back by saying to this, well, isn't meditation on the four immeasurables, etc., another antidote? So isn't it the case that we have other sort of antidotes that act in opposition to our anger and attachments? For example, there are other antidotes like meditating on love and compassion, the four immeasurables, like thinking with regard to whatever being we see, thinking, may they be free from suffering, may they have happiness, having this attitude where whoever we encounter, we don't view them with a sense of closeness or distance, but have a kind of equanimity and feel joy, want other sentient beings to be happy. So these are the kinds of antidotes that this opponent is saying, well, aren't those meditations on the four immeasurables antidotes to our attachment and aversion and so forth? And while it is the case that, for example, when it comes to anger, it's said that we should meditate on love, or we should habituate ourselves to patience in that case in order to get rid of that anger. Or when it comes to attachment, meditating on the unpleasantness of the object, getting rid of our kind of seeing the good qualities of something can reduce the manifest attachment that we are feeling. And so while those methods work in order to reduce or get rid of those sort of manifest afflictions at that time, they are not contrary to the fundamental cause in the way that the wisdom realizing selflessness is. So while they can have that kind of temporary reduction, this isn't something that can extricate them from the root.
Oh, yeah. That about Raluki, Blanjagua. Chamba so churches, Chambada Nigila Sobadua. Oh, Tenimiduba Combaso to churches. Shindo Niba Zawa, Chube, Sarchube, Nani Pidu Chimba Maimbatas, Chamba Combalatene, Soba Combalatene, and Miduba Combalatene, the Shada Condoda, or Tozuki, Nimbo, Tozula Nene, Tos Nature to do this water. Yina ko Nimbo Tetsawan and Mera Sotum Genge, Nimbo to Mari Negam Negama, Jamchuya, Tonda Nimbo Nashila to go no. Shamso Shindo. Niba Zawane Chebe, Muni Pidu Chimba Maimbatasa, but Yakshu get in it Niba, going to the best Zawane Melsu, Zawane Melsu, Mamba Nakia Yungumato. Kotanda Danda Pam Melsuade, Shingles in the Kanapache Shabnea, or Netzawa de Niki Yungodo. The Shindo Niba Zawane Tarchebe, Muni Pidu Chimba de Mares, continuing Chamba Combata, Roa, or to Nimbu Pitu Chimba de Mares. Karesna, Nemo change Momba, Nanzi, Nemo change Momba Ase, Narzi, Narinda, Nemo change Momba Tangsora, Nemo change Momba Tas, Tangzida Butetansora. Zindangoson Gava maybe Echersa, or Titan Zindangoson gave you a mother. Cabartase, Chaso Neba. 그 녀모쟁이 말이바 대자와신 베자 어 잠바다 저와라 소바테zo 아니 디 가수라 말이바 콘도다가 제차도 요사게 자와 가사 단지 말이바 대 삼로타야 텔케 뉴기오마 대단 진당어서 겨 말에 지디게 따요 바라오 따요 반제 지디게 라오 따 매반 진바데 마르와 어디 두자코 진당어서 겨 말에세 Nyamojangi Mongbada Zindang son Gavamebe, Chambata Tawala Soba, Nibu Piduchimba de Marese. Tabata, Chaso Niba Kunse, Nyamojangi Mariba Teza, the Chada Kondunga, Jetadola Sobatezukanga, now sometimes Jishuk Chambuchiki, and it is our Jenny Kigorako. Zawa Sabin the Masu Zawa Koke and get Tire de Ora. So tell a man and it's our name, so at the Yungumare. Chaso Niba Gunyamo Mujangi Mariba, it's our changing la Ase, it's our Jenny Kigua, Yila, Tean Jisola Taver Rashim Bijatea, so Rarang, social Mene, Nanga, so Rawa Chimbe, Jisola Tower. 풍부한 랑시 깨지게 소보다 sem다 초아마도 요 말데 이내 디나리아 텔레본주 챙게게 나오 냠베네 랑게 통게 랑수 통게 라와도 예배가 직설라 따와 그 싸워치니 기비와래 송구도 어디치구나.
So then in response to that query by the opponent, Gyaltsab-je says that it follows that love, etc., are not the supreme direct antidotes that extirpate faults because they do not directly oppose defiled ignorance and the mode of apprehension that is self-grasping. So while it is the case that, say, meditating on love acts as an antidote to the manifest anger that one might have, those kinds of meditations are unable to remove the faults from their roots. So here, it's sort of like if we just take off the top of a tree but don't get the roots out, it can still grow again. So in this way, those types of meditations do not directly oppose this defiled ignorance, this root of all of our of all of the other attachment and anger and so forth. So it says here, it follows that this reason pervades because attachment and all the other faults have a root that is defiled ignorance, which is also the nature of the view of the self in the perishable collection. So, or perishable composites. So when we have this kind of strong sense of I, and based upon that, we then give rise to anger and attachment and so forth. When we meditate on love and compassion or patience and other antidotes to those afflictions, we don't actually get at the root. As long as we are observing that kind of independent I, grasping at some kind of I that is within our aggregate somehow. It's not any of them, but yet it's somehow in control of them and sort of motivating and moving those aggregates. So long as we have that kind of view, all of the other faults are going to arise. And these antidotes don't act in a way that directly opposes that mode of grasping.
뭐야? 다 짜와디 봐 그대로와 잠소 못한 게임에 실수도 잠바다 짜와라 소바 세미실에 소바 대조야 얘네 뭔가 말해봐 당진단 진단 개와케요 말해서라 잠소 못한 게임에 실 신도 예바 살주메 잠바다 짜와도 저기 콘도다 부디 좀발이야 또서 내가 콘도 총도 따야다 콘도 마지와를 팽기어데 자원의 매번 속에 년부채 두고 말해서 신도 예바 살주지 당중이 년무 살주지게 아니 년부 말해서 그래서는 년무 장마대 니구때 자와세 예바 년무 받고 장마대 다들 좀 받이 자와세는 거라 아 삼자 삼루 숙체 붙이자 텔레테니 시체는 거도 년무 강가 니구때 자와세서 대양 아오냐버도 소소그 귤은 뭐기어도 소소귤인 직다 아오냐베 직다 되게 자와체니 기거래서 어디 자와치 되시잖아 되게.
So then looking at the root verses for this, it says, love, etc., do not extirpate faults because they do not oppose ignorance. All faults have a root that is that ignorance, which is also the view of the self in the perishable composites. So love and compassion and so forth, although they can act in temporary ways to alleviate or reduce our anger, for example, they are they do not directly oppose this ignorance grasping at a self. So they're not able to uproot all of our afflictions because they don't oppose that fundamental ignorance. So all of our faults and afflictions come from this root of ignorance, this view of the perishable composite. So there's this thought of I that views some kind of an autonomous, the existing self, and then based upon that, we give rise to our other afflictions. So any antidote that doesn't directly contradict that mode of grasping is unable to remove that.
Oh yeah, Taniba Yandiridwa. Nyomo Janji Marikba Jitale Session member Trubas Takaji Tobasagdwa Marikba Sudan Comomba of Chile, Michelle Momba of Chile Sigaresa Jita Suko Tumbuja Titi Maresico Taxer Vichete Tawa Tangajil Sigaresa And the Kazu Parushal Jigda in Jigda de Marikpa in said Marikpa Jigda Chipa so the Shig to take arrested over your. Oh, that is Tipa, take all Shigura. Nyomo change Mariba Jitale Geshe, Geshe member Truba, Nyomo change Mariba said that Jigda Nibute, Jigda Koran, Nyomo change Mariba Redera. Mariba in a Jigda in the park of Mare, Kansa Shangi Tangzito, Shala Mini Tatu Zimbatozo, Nyomo Mariba Rede, Jigda Sigmadua, take a stand to Saswa. Oh, take all Shigura. Maribane Stakaji Lagiora. Maribane Simjo Miseva number Changelas. Maribas to 7 Mege, and it's Chiracheva Mezinga Maribas Siduasagora, Yinguruasa. Jigdani Yons Cheba number changes Simjo Ben Jigda, Jigso Pungunale, Chiva Tenpa, Sabu of Church, Taxation, Tumbucha, Jingengi Simju Shebachil Sekuduasa. Tenane Kera some children jigta de Marigba Yeshe, Marigba or Yeshe Jigta, Marigba or Chipa Shegdua. They take Medus and Aswara, take Kajik Dabatero, or Tichituna.
So then we turn to proving that defiled ignorance is not substantially different from the view of the self in the perishable. So some then come to this kind of idea that this view of the self in the perishable, we talk about a defiled or afflicted ignorance, and then this view of the perishable. And some have this idea that it's this ignorance is just sort of like being deluded or being unaware of something. And so they think that there might be a difference somehow between that kind of ignorance, lack of knowledge, and the view of the perishable collection as being ignorance. So here, the opponent says then, ignorance is a mental factor that has the aspect of unclearness. So rather than sort of being somehow determinate, it's a lack of awareness of something. And so the view of the self in the perishable is a mental factor that has the aspect of definite determination. So it is unacceptable that those have one nature. So again, this opponent is coming up with this idea that ignorance is just sort of a lack of knowledge or being unclear with regard to something, whereas the view of the perishable is very much has a determined object, something that has been sort of decided on and is a determined object. So here we should understand that according to our own system, the view of the perishable is ignorance, but not all instances of ignorance are the view of the perishable collection. We can have the ignorance that is in reference to grasping at another person as being a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. As we saw before, that's grasping at the self of persons, but it isn't the view of the perishable. So there's a smaller pervasion for the view of the perishable, but we do assert that it is ignorance.
No, yeah. Tadil Rarupa, Nyomo Changira, Nyomo Changi Marikba, Nyomo Changi Marikba, Ribat Namitobe, Shirabji Midusho Yelasa. Nyomo Changi Marikba, Tamitobe Shirabji Mitumbe Shore, Zindam Mitumbe Shore de Ora, Mitumbe Choyela. Tell us some less, Rigbe Meba, Mitu Yelas, tell us some less, Rigbe Meba Mitun Shoda, Shamba Mitun Shoni, Marikba. Marikba Mayin Bartal, Marikba Simjo Yimba Niji, Minam Zimbe Kebeshir. Ode, Taranlu Pasidua. Mitun Shaw de la Sumde Jiwa Eswara, Chilia, Meba Mitun Shaw, Shemba Mitun Shaw, Gawa Mitun Shaw Saras, Sumyugdua. Tell us some Rigba Meba Mitun Shaw, Rigbe Meba Mitun Shaw Singatida, Rigbe. Meba Mitun Shaw, Shemba Mitun Shaw Nibute. Any Marikba Mayin Bartati, Marikba Mares Orda. Meba Midun Chosco Mengage Sigora. Shamba Midun Chosu Corale Shanda, Samal Shamba Midun Chosigora. The Tim Marikba Mares or Sumju Marwas or Rigba Meb Midun Choda, Shamba Midun Choni, Choni, Marikba Mayin Baratal, Marikba Simju Ibaniji, Minam Zimbe Cabbage. Meba da Cole Shamba Samade, Maribake Marti, using Shebake Marwasigora. Mares Ranupala. Tan Gawa Midun Shoyino Shinaskoga. Oh, the Karsura. Marik Bata Mitum Basum Yubanane. Zinda Mitum Bangawa Midun Shoyino Kajik Sulana. Taralu and Palagua. What is it to Condena Sabre Mission.
So here, then the response to this from J is that defiled ignorance is an opposing factor to the knowledge that is the wisdom realizing no self. So it follows it follows that from among the three types of opposing conditions, ignorance is neither the opposing factor of nescience nor some other opposing factor, because by the very fact that ignorance is a mental factor, it must necessarily apprehend an aspect of an intentional object. So here, what is being said is that defiled ignorance, as we understand it in our system, has a contrary way of grasping, contrary to the wisdom realizing no self. So it's not of the three types of opposing conditions here. So ignorance is not simply nescience or like a lack of knowledge with respect to something. It's not just that lack of knowledge, and it is not just some other opposing factor. Roger has this a little bit in the notes, but anything that would act as an opposing factor to knowledge that is not a mental state or a mental factor, that's not suitable to be defined as ignorance. And so ignorance here is something that has that opposing mode of grasping. And so this is the case again at the end of this, because by the very fact that ignorance is a mental factor, it must necessarily apprehend an aspect of an intentional object. So it has a defined object, and it is has a mode of grasping that is in direct opposition to the knowledge that is the wisdom realizing no self. And then and then the opponent will begin their sort of questioning with only ignorance is a contradictory opposing factor to the wisdom realizing no self, and we'll respond to that.
No, that Dagir Tawe, Seni Changi, Jisola Tawane, Sigdwa. Samsada, I make I now I lose today. Tao Tiniga Dangil Shagiora. Oh, Yambe Rao and Azimbateda. I make Rao and taking mix in Bate, Jiktasha, Nadang I use in Basigora. Oh, the Tada Dagir Tawe, Seni Changi, Jisola Tawane. Nyumba changi marikpale shendo rikpa mariste nyumu changi marikpare tile shen mare songyora dole se te imba karesan dole tami tokbe shirap le zindangu su lokbar mikba nyiki nyumu changi marikpa songbe shires on dole ya ne tongbe marikpa da tezuli ya tami tokbe shirap le zindangu songgewe zindan mitunba tangzi di rangwe nga yoba rangwe nga yuwa yoba jingora tambi tobe shirab dik rangwe nga meba rangwe nga yuwa meba togyorda samlu tangsa ke yukura pe jindang ngunge re deora gewa re deora dole tambi tobe shirab le jindang ngunsu lokbar meba yiki nyamo chanji marikbar songbe shirda asan jikta di nyamo chanji marikbar yin songyo resu donar te rikba tambi tobe shirab te gewa midun shoyin be shirse jikda te rikba dami tokbe shirab te genda tangzi te tini mitun be shoy reso be shirse tege to statin dole kong changdwa tege to dawa trumen dole tela marikba da trawa kanshena yanda ba chitawa shingi chönamla lakbar tondokba da trawa kanyba ose marikba dawa trumen dole dwa tela marikba da trawa kanshenase ta marikba da trawa nimbut karesana yanda ba chitawa shingi chönamla lakbar tondokba da trawa kanyba ose yanda ba chitawa shindu tala sobat da yanda ba chitawa shindu lakbar tondokba da trawa tromendokba korane juna shitami ba tonggen go atilesi go rese tondokba da trawa kanyba oshida teshindu Sajubale, Tatini Chibaras, Sajuban Doka Suason Shas, Carison Dosuna, Jigdena, Never Chuba, Kanchini, Te Tamjene, Tadongobar Shambale, Jonga Yindiese, Tadongobar Shambada Trena, Mijungo, Sheson Sauce. Sachuben de Kapsu, Tome Marik Bashedu, Sungbe Kapsu, Jigdena Nebar Chuba, Kang Chini, Tetamje, Jigdena Ya, Numola Soba, Kaze, Yuba, Sama Tamje, Sungo, Tamjene, and Tado Number Shembale joined the Ngao Nyamdo, Soso Bening Ngao, Ngayo Nyambe, Number Shembate, Zawajeni Shichen, and Kang Gore, Song Shasa, Tado Number Shembale joined in the 다 동거 심바다 제나 민중어서 당지디 매버차소나네 나이다 차신을 차단하려서 봐 녀몽 백견 삼아 용구 말해 송구도 다 동거 심바다 제나 민중어 세송소서 담에 독배 시럽기 담에 독배 시럽기 응게 담에 독배 시럽기 유기 응게 짐바 녀모차게 마릭 발템바나서 되게 도되게 담에 독배 시럽기 유기 응게 진다 미팅반 짐바데 녀모차게 마릭 바 템바나서 담에 독배 시럽기 유기 응게 미팅바 다 요반 짐바데 송고도 녀모차게 마릭 발템바나 당지 마릭 바 템바 신두세데스 다 tonda 녀모제 머리만 직다디 텐디사 마릭바디 마릭바 임바 땡기 와레스래 신도세데 다도 소와 다도 마소와 땡게 짐바미시베시 어테 독초디인데 다도 라오에 다 요반 제나마도 담에도 베시럽게 게 짐바미테베시서 담아도데 제소야 알레티바치도나
No. So here, then again, this opponent is saying, well, it's just ignorance that is a contradictory factor opposing this wisdom realizing no self. And here in response, Gyaltsab-je is establishing that this view of the perishable is ignorance. So it follows that it is not reasonable that the view of the self in the perishable composites, which is defined as the view of I and mine, be other than ignorance. So here, when it comes to ignorance as a more general category, and then we have the view of the perishable that is grasping at this kind of an I, like an autonomous I, and then the mine in the sense of like my body, my hands, my mind, and so forth. Those two, the grasping at an I and mine, are both the view of the perishable. And this view of the perishable cannot be anything other than ignorance. So here it then quotes, because a Shastra says that defiled ignorance is directly inverted seeing through a mode of apprehension opposite to the wisdom realizing no self. And because the view of the self in the perishable too is a cognition that is the opposing factor contradicting the wisdom realizing no self. So here, this kind of holding to some independent, autonomous sense of an I or a self is an inverted seeing. It is in direct opposition to the mode of apprehension of the wisdom realizing no self. So this grasping at a self, grasping at a sense of I and the wisdom realizing no self are in direct opposition. And so something that is in direct opposition to that wisdom is defined then as ignorance in this context. So then it continues by Gyaltsab-je quotes from a sutra, the Chandra Pradipa Sutra, where it says, what is it that is separate from ignorance? Whatever is separate from extra superimposition on the true ultimate nature of Dharma. So what is the state that is freedom from ignorance or separated from ignorance is that which is separated from this kind of extra superimposition that occurs due to our self-grasping. So that's that which is in accordance with the actual reality, such as no such self-existing is then what is separate from the extra superimposition on the true ultimate nature of Dharma. So this continues then with a quotation from the 10 Ground Sutra, the Dasha Bhumika Sutra, all conventional faulty actions arising in the world originate from manifest desire for the self. If there is separation from manifest desire for the self, they will not occur. So here, this kind of manifest desire clinging to an I or a self, that is what is the root of all of the rest of our afflictions. That acts as the cause for all of the various faults that will arise within the world. So if one eliminates that manifest desire for that self, that grasping at a self, then those will not arise. So here, since we have shown that defiled ignorance is the apprehension of the direct opposite of the object of the wisdom realizing no self, it is clear that we have shown that self grasping is ignorance, because it is impossible that one apprehends the direct opposite of wisdom without grasping at a self. So here, ignorance needs to be that which is in direct opposition to the wisdom realizing no self. So therefore, it has to be something that is grasping at a self, not just some sort of lack of knowledge or other way of understanding ignorance.
Oh yeah. Tatanda Sachuben Doshiwa Yuga. Sachuben Doles and Jidena never chuba kanchin yuba de tamja tadongumber shimbale chungare sondua. Tadongumber shimbale chungare swade jigdal tengiordo. Oh, this one better. The Sachuben do de tangzi marik bar temper tasa. Tado Jimben Jigda de Marikwa in Batangioris, de Marikwa Maris still lost Pengio Maris and Gora. Caris Shadow Nase. Marikwa Tangi Manas, such a bent dode. Tanda dode tende Yana Chunigana, Tome Marikwa Tembe Cabres. Tende Jigda Tene, Marikwa Tango Satel and Jigda Marikwa Maina and Jigda Tembe the Madirido, or Tesson Demeres. Tende Yana Chunigi Marikbe Yala Tembe Kapsupabe se, te tornesim. Yala Chuna and Marikwa Masha Jigda de She Maru Mainga Jishan Maduro. Te torne Tanzin Tamba, Tadon Zimbe Jigda, Tamba, Dremedu Juveshis. Tena donde Marikwa le Shembe, Tawa Tembani Rigba Maina, Tatonda Dode Kajik Samna, the Jigda Tangidos, Tawa Tangidos, Te Marikwa Mares, Jigda the Marikwa Kagare Sam Giorno. O de marin jida kora mari bare sti shegwa tena do de mari pale shembe tawa temba ni rigba mai no se mari pa mai ngenge jida temba de teg maris mari bo kora jida de jida kora mari bare sungor ta tonda tere o ya tiji tuna.
So here, then again, it follows that the above passage from the Dasha Bhumika Sutra also shows that self-grasping is ignorance. So here, where we have said all conventional faulty actions arise in the world originate from manifest desire from a self. This idea of manifest desire of a self is referring to the view of the perishable, grasping at an I. This is showing that self-grasping is ignorance. Because if it were otherwise, then when the teacher considered whether to establish the factor of ignorance among the 12 factors of dependent origination, he would have left it out, and there would have been no connection between ignorance and his teaching on self-grasping. So here, this was taught in the context of the 12 links of dependent origination, and this then, which is being identified, the view of the perishable, must be referring to this ignorance, because this is it's taught in the context of the 12 links of dependent origination, and thus is teaching that the view of the perishable is this ignorance. And so since he did specify that ignorance was self-grasping, it is unreasonable to attempt to show that that sutra has a view other than that ignorance is self-grasping. So here, this is making it clear that the Buddha has indicated that the view of the perishable is that kind of ignorance, or ignorance is referring to the view of the perishable, not something else there. And so then the opponent is going to come back with another kind of qualm here, saying, since ignorance and the view of the self and the perishable are said to be concomitant factors, ignorance is shown to be a concomitant factor by entailment, and we'll get to what that means.
Oh yeah, Tayan de Shedwa. Tede Jita Marik Bada Chungde Yimbes Kajik Shegora. jigda de donale marikpa chungden songe chingudwa marikpa ne ka jigba tawa da chungba demba yisinge sen gede jigda marikpa da chungden yinbes chungden ji kone marikpa pangne demba yinges ko nyamdo yores jigda de nyamdo marikpa yores ko ni chungba nyamdo yores tengi yormado jigda marikpa yinse tengi mares samge yorno kaji dodege kede jigda marikpa da chungden yinbe chungden ji kone marikpa pangne demba yinges jigda de nyamdo marikpa de yores de shugiba pangne lo yolia kor chig yores pangne demba yinge shando na tingi longle chungden do shebada gegido se ani jigda da marikpa chungden yinse jigda de marikpa da nyamdo chungba de yores sungba de gyawar yoros shenas de kajik choba de ra techi gyuna.
So here, then the opponent comes back with this idea that, since ignorance and the view of the self in the perishable are said in the Dasha Bhumika to be concomitant factors, ignorance is shown to be is shown as a concomitant factor by entailment. So if it were otherwise, the assertion that those two are simultaneous concomitant factors would contradict the explanation of concomitant factors in scripture. So here, the opponent has this wrong idea that when the Buddha uses this term, or when this term concomitant is being used with respect to ignorance and the view of the self and the perishable, it's not referring to those being the same kind of thing, but rather that they are concomitant in the sense that we usually speak of, like with mental factors, that they arise simultaneously, that they can be simultaneous. So if it were the case that they were the same, then it would contradict that explanation of them being concomitant factors, because if they're the same thing, then how could they be sort of simultaneous? So this is the opponent's view here.
Oh yeah, that pa ralu sesha shigdwa jigda mari par kelang nas jigda de mari pa res kelana ta chen chungde do jigda de mari pa da nyam do chungba de ba yore sungba de da ge do slarwa o de gawa yo ma res tingi chungde do sheba da gawa cho ba kayin ba dir ge ke chung se ja me ba de gawa che so ne yo ma res gora chungde do tembe long de se jigda de marikpa da nyamdo chungba yore tembe long tege tini ten do temba maenge jigda de marikpa mare te ten da mare suwara temba maenge se palaksha dan tembe naksal sheba shindo jigda marikpe chochi do tembe sheba chawa rikbe shis palaksha dan tembe nakses chi na palaksha sene jaga medo mabsha sing jung gudwa chamsho hotel sigora tatunda zenden dan dembe nakse seorach zenden dan dembe nakse sudu zenden din da nakse be ngo khagare sigo marwa zenden koran de nakse ke chashe shi bal koku gordo otina shire ese palaksha dan dembe nakse sheba shindo jigda marik be chochi do tembar shebar chawa rigbe shis jigda de marik be chochi rese zenden dan dembe nakse sewa na shiri zenden de nakse ki cho shiri nakse sudu shingna mabu yisudil sigwara nakse dine kasa kawada shibar chaga jigda mariba cho shiri tamba shibar chaga rikba shiri jigda nyamu chanji mariba tiri tandar chochido tamba shibar chaga tiri shira ta jigda la nyamu chanji mariba kyabsi chidan jigda sayade soso la meni ngao nyambe lo dali jigda se soa san jigda ina mariba inbe kyabga res mariba ina jigda inbe kyabga ma res ta tanda te hako ni diri mambu shede tira jigda la nyamu chanji mariba kyabja anse nyamu ingengi mariba dali nyamu chanji mariba sigwara shidru ingengi mariba yungwara chidan nyamu chanji mariba jigda la nyamu chanji mariba kyabja chikshu la sudu nyamu chanji mariba lan jigda inbe kyabga ma res kansa lejin tabu digi chujin li gi tade rangi tube rawa chujin yoban jimba tabu de Kansa Tangzi Jikta Mare Sura. Oh, then correct. Jida Yamo Janya Maribe Captain Chishula, my captain, Tangzi Langi La Soba, Te Sungden Division, Tangzi membership, Tangzi Langi, Naranja Jula, Tatakman Zimba Tangzi Langi Orba. Tade Nemet Nade Nene, some Tanda, your mobile, Tangay Business, Chigranchi, some Koguati Tangzira, two diseases. Tade Name Tade Natanda, some Tande mobile, Tangay, some. To ngame to get tade to mahomba sama chikbache chigrandin doshavana shi sam kodwa shirubasa na shi takbe ta chigrese ne hotenesh tele jigda lenje da kunda ni ngora jigda lenje tabude marik bare se jigda mare sungar ta don da se tishana dire kansa shenle meni ta don je bade marik bare jigda mare sne digra tim chigbade jigda lenje mare sundu Tangzi Langila Soba Mariba Sunday to Yabesha. Logan Dawa Dragba Jan Jigdati Mariba in Bate, Gombulu to combine Omeka Sungore, so what did the Tunani this one? Yeah.
So here, then the response to this from Gyaltsabje, again, this opponent is saying that there's a contradiction, that ignorance and the view of the self and the perishable can't be the same thing because they're said to be concomitant, as in simultaneous. So here the response is, since we accept that the view of the self and the perishable is ignorance, it follows that whatever argument is made, that there is a contradiction with the scriptural explanation that these two are concomitant factors, there is no problem of contradiction here because the scriptural passage that shows them as concomitant does not show those two as separate objects. So here, it's not saying that they are concomitant in the sort of technical sense of the term, but rather that they are sort of harmonious, or they are the same thing. It's actually referring to it in that way, not showing them to be distinct in the way that the opponent is trying to claim. So here, it is reasonable that it is to be explained as showing that the view of self in the perishable partakes of ignorance, or is like a type of ignorance, as when one says a palasha forest. So here, if you say a palasha is a particular type of forest, and so if you have like a palasha forest, so here, palasha forest, or like a sandalwood forest, this is one type of tree that is in the forest. It doesn't mean that like every tree there is of that type. And so too, when it comes to the view of the self and the perishable, although the view of self in the perishable is pervaded by defiled ignorance, as in every instance of a view of the self in the perishable is defiled ignorance, it is not pervaded by the view of the self in the perishable. So it's not the case that every instance of ignorance is the view of the perishable. So the view of the perishable, again, is in reference to oneself, holding to a sense of an I, like some kind of an autonomous I in relation to one's own aggregate. And this is said to be afflicted ignorance, but there are types of afflicted ignorance that are not that kind of view of the perishable. So holding to some other type of being, whether it's like Devadatta or whoever else, and you're holding them to be a really truly existent person, that is a case of defiled ignorance, but it is not a case of the view of the self and the perishable. So and we can have other types of ignorance. For example, the and because the innate grasping at permanence, etc., are also concomitant with ignorance, or are instances, types of ignorance. So, for example, we all have this innate sense of grasping at permanence, like I am the same person that I was before, and I'm going to be the same in the future. I'm the same as I was yesterday, and I'll be the same tomorrow. That kind of sense of permanence that we have as an innate thing. Now, again, we can have an innate kind of grasping at permanence as well as acquired through some sort of philosophical thinking, but like the way that certain tenet schools grasp at a permanent self. But instances of, say, our innate grasping at permanence are concomitant with ignorance, as in they are types of ignorance. And so Acharya Chandrakirti also comments that it is in the intention of the protector Nagarjuna to assert that the view of the self in the perishables, perishable is ignorance. So these are not to be understood as different things, but rather as the view of the perishable is a type of ignorance, and ignorance has a larger pervasion.
Oh yeah, that's somebody do. Somebody and did it. That don't the carshosna. Tami to be shirab ni jindan gave kone nimbur tembase. Tana chamba da ro chamba da miduba kombaso konto da dosha 자원에 매번 성게 님보 말은 진단 개회 님보 말이 내급 거 명몽 주동 거에 다 텐데게 코타버래 마ton 진단 개회 뭐 진님보 말에 성으로 자는 진단 개회 뭐 진님보도 당시단 진단 개회 뭐 진님보도 가래서 나서거래 네 다음에 또 시럽니 진단 개회 거네 님보 템바네서 잠소 몽단 개와 매나서 다 잠바 라소바테다 몽바 다돈 짐바테다 진단 것은 개와 매나서 삼로타에 된 진단 수도 지대 라웨 다 예반진 지대 라웨 다 매반진의 콘 진단 삼로타에 유대베 다다응게레 되어와 지 라웨 다 예반진 지 매반진 되어와 전 진단 개와디 가르스나서라 잠소 몽바단 개와 매나 오나 잠소 당신 다도 준비 몽바단 진단 개와 매나 오늘 다도 준비 당진 개와데 가래 시나스 아니 묘모자게 마릭 바단 진단 거서 개와 가인 바데 디르셰 버샤데 스타디 셰기 있으거라 가드레스는 동이 떡베 따와다 대 진단 거서 개외서 다음에 밤 동반이세 단딜에 동반이세도 간사랑게 두베 자유게 다음에 버테란 거고래 간사랑게 두베 자유게 동반이섬 간사랑게 두베 자유게 동베 간사게 다음에 떡베 따와다 대 진단 것은 개와래 당진된 진단 것은 개와래 개외서래 땅방아만 디 떼세 개와가인 디르샤차 세드와 짜와 겨와가인 디르샤자 똥이 따다 땡게스 똥반이 떡베 시럽 담이 떡베 시럽 티 똥반이 떡베 시럽 담이 떡베 시럽 찍어라 가랑게 투베 자유게 담에 바 다게 똥반이 떡베 시럽 티 진단 겨와래 해서도 겨와가인 디르샤자 강방아만 디 때다라야 셰괴제스 겨와가인 디르샤자 똥이 따와데 티 진단 것은 게 녀보레스 티 녀도 데니 셰고레스 거라 तभी तमा ये के तांजे जिता ता मरिक बन गया हमारे पलाक्षा ता देबे चंदे ता देबे नाक्षे से ना गया तेंगे दूसरे गया तेंगे मारे थे जिता दे मरिक बे छोचे ये बकोगरे से ती क्या गया पोंग बे लें ती क्या मारे से ती गया ते देरे दास ये बोते या ते बदले चार करे सुगोरा 동이 도베 타와다 텐진당고 순게베 강방가만 디 테다르셰 그게스 겨와세디 카인디셰셰 게본 바시토나 세타에게 발락샤단 덴베스든 게본 바시토 브라테 데게 마레세 데네 시긴딘주 테다라 제바 릭베체로스 동이 다다 땡게 체르스 겨왕원에디 디레스티에 냠도야 차르고레시 베토레 It's all the good one. Give a gain dirisha, don't you did that thing gets his. What is it, Kuna?
So then we turn to the next point, which is showing that the wisdom realizing no self is the antidote through its opposition to the mode of apprehension that is self-grasping. So here, the opponent again brings up, well, if love, etc., do not oppose confusion, then what does oppose it? So if these kind of like meditating on love and meditating on the unpleasantness of the object are able to only temporarily sort of suppress our afflictive emotions, such as anger and attachment and so forth, but are not in direct opposition, they're not able to remove afflictions from their root, well, then this opponent is asking, well, what does actually get rid of what does oppose this kind of ignorance? And so here it says then, it is to be explained here as whatever directly opposes defiled ignorance and the mode of apprehension that is self-grasping, because the view that realizes voidness directly opposes that mode of apprehension that is self-grasping. So here, in response to this, they say that the view realizing emptiness or voidness, and here this is referring to selflessness in the sense of a person's not being a self-sufficient, substantially existent entity. And so this is showing that uh, again, the first line of this where it says, whatever contradiction there is here is to be explained. And this is referring to the kind of opposing condition in that it is because the view of voidness opposes that ignorance, it is clearly proven to oppose the nature of that and hence all false. So the meaning of the first line needs to be explained this way. If it shows only the avoidance of contradiction rather than a contradictory condition, then it is unreasonable to make this the way of interpreting the words. So basically, here it's making clear that it's not trying to say that there's some sort of contradiction in the text, but rather that the antidote is that which is contradictory, or that which is in direct opposition to that ignorance. And so the wisdom realizing voidness then is clearly proven to oppose and destroy the nature of that ignorance and all the attachment and other faults that are its results, because wisdom destroys that ignorance through directly opposing the mode of apprehension. So it is through this direct mode of apprehension, and the contradiction then being that of the antidote in relation to this mode of false grasping that is being proven here.
Oh yeah. That did that. Tony talk about shirap church answer. Marik Bate, Rangshin Tate, Jebu Neva Chaso Kundan Geshe, never rub to Truba Indies. That Ranga to be say, Dagi, Tongbani talk by shirap tes, Ya Dame talk by shirap te. Any Marik Ba, Tadon Zimbe, Rama Ta Yoban Zimbe, Kansa Rama Ta Yoban Zimbe, Marik Bate, Rangshin dance. Marik Bate, Rangshin dance. Te Jebu. Daja Kontunga Diala Soba Nemo Shanda Samasura, Te Debu Neba Chakso Kunda, Gelshin, or Tetan Geshin, Tela Neba Shingan, Nuji de Rese, Teta Gumpa Ponsinge, Tanzida, Tanzigi Debu Chaktan, La Soba, Nemo Samo Tamgelia, Tetan Gaya Gaya Midichoro, Mebson Game Midicho, and it tell a never rub the Nuji, talk to William Buteres, rub the Truba in the start, and that Tama to be the Dami to be shirapte, Tangzin Dan, Chaso Yamu Tamjagi Nimbo de Timebson did, Zawan the Mebson de Tires, or did Nangba Tukuyara. Rabdu Truba Yende, Marik Ba Teda, Zundangus gave a conetella nervous. Dami to be Tongbanyam, Dami to be shirapte, Tongbany to be Lotege. Ni Tangzin da Tangzin di Debu Chasola Soba Kangalia, Sawa ne Meba Songbeg, Nusi Nimbutom Dendi Tires, Tehago, Tati Sikuna.
Then here, in kind of the form of a syllogism, it says, the wisdom realizing voidness, and again here this emptiness or voidness is referring to the person's not being a self-sufficient, substantially existent entity, according to this text. So that wisdom realizing voidness is clearly proven to oppose and destroy the nature of that ignorance and all the attachment and other faults that are its results. So here, one is trying to establish then that it is this wisdom realizing voidness is in direct opposition to that mode of apprehension of self-grasping, what is being what is trying to be established or proved by Buddhists, this is essential, is that this wisdom realizing emptiness is able to, by its direct opposition to the mode of apprehension, extricate that grasping at a self from its root, and thereby all of the results that come from that, so all the attachment and other faults that are its results, will be eliminated, because this wisdom realizing emptiness is able to oppose directly that kind of wrong mode of apprehension and remove it from its root.
Oh yeah, that tunda bodo share the tunda to do the shipa to share the tunda karsha do sen namba ge ta meba tanzin de kohe tsawares rawe ta de yoma range to be ta de yoma res te shi che range to be da ji sam rawa jumba tege any ngai sam ra ngai tene te chaje da tele never can get to the chagdang lo kete ti kya ganga yung do sam gyora 자 nyamo 참제 방지기 짜와타르도 와데 담에 떠고 그러마도 방기마레 송거라 다 땡어도 자가 개바 두다마 개바 신다 요르바 뭐 대조 다데 요송거라 라에 다데 요고레 라에 다게 다게와 요고레스데 티타가 샤고르와 로지 다치 샤네 다 타르바 톱고레스야 타르바 셰고 타르바 토에 탑가레스 다 견도 되네 라 대졸 견도 되네 대야고 말에 삼 견도 되네 아니 현자의 방고래 송거라 다 라루라데 견도 되네 현자 내가 문주와 너그러와 코알랑게 버저에 쳐도 코알라 차데버데 네반도 버쳐도 네 코알라 뒤쪽으로 가서라 민중집에 쳐도 코에 견 삼을당도 나 차데어데 현자의 마초르 따했던데 대견시지 삼을당데 애네 뚱에 왜 신도 돈에 이 중용도 와서 내가 이 파차지 신지들 따뜻주 따뜻 야부레면 도와서 민중 깨겨라 최소 건여모 내가 문주와 너의 돈들도 검거라 그냥 검거라 코에 그냥 검거라 차유기 차과 수천번에 차유기 그냥 삼으다 차과 마시에 돈도 거라 어때나시 기단 나바게 켈링 단데 잠바다 미투바 콤바토 내가 녀몽 유아시에 돈들 검거라 그냥 삼을 당겨라 타이나 유모 짜와는 좀 지티 말해세 대 당진디 담에 또 그래 시거라 다 신다 개바 쪽에 다데 여산타 담에 또 그래 시요 말도 껴데 삼르다나 아니 야지 유모도 우리 타르토도 그래 송거라 배는 아주 명감 순감 숨미세 삼대 담보니 버숨바 시바다 송미다 저야 깨요로 kelya debe tanda ngara debe debe sada mineda luda lonjeda semda zukanga kyota gyore debe luina sharu tuche pumbo yaw mare na chojo kala sa konge chi damde ka techmi tengora le lonjeda kanga tunge ran shisha yaw mare sam ene debe semina rakba nyamo sikke ne tege nyamo mabuya kenge samde tambulya lesna semdu shiwa ene ne da lu da long ju de pusum chobo lu to zo ye rang shi chen o tinde yo de sam de ba la kyon du te kong ma la yuen den du de ne de be ne lu long ju du shen ja de do re ne ko nyamo ki ju ma cha go re na ra ju ne da lu da long ju da shen ja yo ba de ju ma cha go re Tim Mershan is some day tambul tele niba sumba tendeche mambo convendua nambata namsheta message sera o the pajo de tarba top de tanzin da dagrin zimba da dagji rawache de yeba shisha chen ya lam shanda chen den dogora namba sanje ba te lam shanda ne droye de nega de maro chawa ne pantu mare 땡이지 건디 아신 시즈바도는 야마요 요라 땡이지 네바 좋아서데 티 인도산 가르소래 땡이 캬바 요산 티탄도 마보셰고에 티용거라 퍼조디스네 담에 떠고면 도세 소세 담에 떠고도 마도 디그 마레스와 툴링 소라다 티와 틸레세세 시기스네 소선 데바디 야셰 딜레연 덴덴도 체라션 덴덴도세 티티디 치치kurna Dudish degree. Oh yeah.
So here then, to sort of give a summary of what we are talking about here, the Buddhists are asserting that grasping at a self is the root of samsara, that holding to some kind of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self is what causes us to give rise to all of our other afflictions. So when we are grasping at such a self, we then give rise to anger and attachment and so forth. And the only way to remove that, the only way that we can get rid of that is by developing the wisdom realizing selflessness or emptiness. This wisdom realizing selflessness is in direct opposition to that mode of grasping that is asserted to be the root of samsara. And thus, one is able to get out of this cycle of suffering. So we need to understand that there are other sorts of masters, and many Indian masters, who do assert that there has to be some kind of a self, some kind of this being. And for them, they say, well, we're not so much looking to get rid of the grasping at a self, but rather by seeing the faults of various objects, we will give up our desire for them. We'll give up clinging for them. So here, in order, when we are trying to develop a renunciation in samsara, we think about the various faults of this. And there are those who say, can meditate on the various faults of samsara, the kinds of sufferings that we experience within that, in order to generate renunciation for all of samsara. But we also see that there are those that are meditating on the faults of various objects in a way that is not removing the sort of attachment from its root, but is temporarily suppressing the kind of attachment from that. So again, the only way to extricate that root of samsara is by developing the wisdom realizing selflessness. But we see, for example, there are those that engage in a kind of practice of meditative stabilization, wherein perhaps they see the defects of the desire realm. They say, oh, those are kinds of objects that I don't want to engage in. And they see the faults of the objects of desire. And in that way, they kind of renounce the desire realm and they renounce the form realm. And through developing this kind of meditative concentration, we have the various levels of meditative concentration within the formless realm. So if one achieves the first actual concentration, one is no longer going to have clinging toward the objects of the desire realm. One doesn't have that manifest kind of desire for those things. And when one then proceeds through these various stages up through endless consciousness, endless space, nothingness, and all the way to the peak of samsara, these really high meditative states, one is able to get rid of the kind of manifest afflictions of the desire realm for a temporary period, but one has done nothing to eliminate the root of samsara. So here again, this is coming down to what is actually able to extricate us from samsara. So just by meditating on the faults of objects, Buddhists would assert, one is able to maybe temporarily suppress some kinds of afflictions, but the only way to remove them permanently and from their root is by developing this wisdom realizing emptiness or wisdom realizing selflessness.
No, yeah, that dimension, that was less. Yeah, cover the mission. Cover the show. Oh, yeah,
Chima dodu mirunga.
ah,
Chotang
oh, yeah, that is.
no.
Marijuana. Niba Tima Doduma, Tira. Tandinema Karishegorasana. Simji Tima Churwa, Kondo Danga Jeda, Tato Shenjala Soba, the Zukan to the Kanga, Sigoto. Timati Simji Timam, Simji Ken, Dosha Kondo Naja Tato, La Soba to Zukanga, Tento Doesi or Marisura, Timan Dodo Mirua. Tandika Thabkhe Melenge. Tagalia to do that to that at the Mabuardo. Or condu Tarbas to man bang Chagam Pese Bang Jes, your mother Sigora. Oh, the Tarbatoya Thabkhe Melenge concert to the Mawakeba to the studio. Oh, take and this Rosana. Niba Timan Dodo Miro as a base. Niba ten seba my days. Kansaki Chagdala Soba, Kondunga Jetado Sobatezo, Dene Sebe, Sene Tarwa Top Sayadaba, today you Marishara. Never dance about Medi Chaso, Soja Yechini bitches. The Soja Jinshinja de la Casa Jinshinja de la Shenja Sosuneta Luda Longil Shenja never do Yokode. Tell never can get you don't know Kondo never to figure. Sosun David turned the true, Medebet turned the say at Tondalia, Chakbateko Shenja Sosukovia so the Chira, Kondo de Milba Kaptisha so the Chira. Then the man and Mikor and Sotovia Simja Kandichinako, Sotovia Yomar, Koradu Rangshire. Semi again, so I get you in a tea, or Madote, Timakaga Megasaji, Kavayo Yoma Resigora. Oh, did never. That's about my inter Soja get changing bitch, Koran Shire. Pumbe Sula Sobashin, Pumbe Kado, the Yibla Soba, the Koran Shire was so in Shinja de Kado, the Yibtachi Yogora, Ranshid Ordination is a Tarbaten to Tovet and the Yoma Resigua, didn't debate the Chi Guna. Yeah.
So then turning to the next point, this is at the 425 that says disposing of the objection that stains are unsuitable to be removed. So all of these kinds of stains or fault, all the various afflictions that we have, desire, attachment, anger, jealousy, and so forth, there are those that would say that these are not things which can be removed. And this is something that is proposed by someone who does not accept liberation. They would not think that such a state of freedom from these afflictions exists. And so turning to the opponent in a commentary, it says the faults cannot be thoroughly eliminated because they are natural to living beings, like form, etc., are natural to a pot. So they would say that anyone that is a living being, they have desire. They will have those afflictions. That is not something that can be removed, but rather that is the nature of a sentient being. So they would say that these afflictions of attachment, anger, and so forth are natural to the minds of beings in their very nature, in the same way that the nature of form is to have shape and color and so forth. So from something being a form, it's necessarily going to have a kind of shape and color and so forth. And they would say, so too, the faults of sentient beings, these kinds of afflictive states of mind, are natural to beings and thus unsuitable to be removed.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, that is it. Oh, yeah, oh, Chira, Taran looks it. Never 10 said to Miro, my imbartas. I can't do it so the limit. That never Ralupa like never said to Miro, my imbarta. Oh, Tene. Kondunga jela sokba kansa ke semjiken lunga yesum jiken to se meba mares gora neba se to mero ama imbarta tetar madru besu se to mero ate seme trubya mares ora se rongu de so kanderes na tertal se neba se to ronga tas gora nebu tame to be shirab je chodan dewana yene dogba ta ya sibe esir nebu tangzin je nebu rawe da de medu sa da so de Pumbula tene takba cham re sam o tende yan do komba ene ene nga da nga se samlu de shukchun ju cha do do tena ne tak chole chakba de she chun ju cha so na tele nebe gengele so ba ene ne kondu sa de ma nyuru do ra rimgi nyuru da yo ba te kanga tu go wa mi kondu sa ba chi ne ya tambo kondu sa ba je shema ko sebe pen de samlu ta kondu li kendo na mi tungi me do mi kanga nyodan do ta de ya wa sam so samlu ta ya kondu ni me do samlu ta ne kondu cho dra yo so to ra sem so samlu ta ne so la ta to ke ba chi shange ma nga ten de chu ta de ten de chu sha sam rimgi nyuru dra yo ba de to go do ngo sum de to go do 다들 년부터 페페제 약속 철철시네 고마 퍼조데 미디어쇼데 고께 선자 뉴뉴도요 알도 어데 년부터 아메도 버 시럽제 초단 데네 테 공부이나 아니 내가 도바 마세 때네 지주메 버튼 데 소요 레스로지 얘네 도바다 자 통해서로서 Nimbe chodan dewa nase, tatamate, Lua, you get Dirakas. Madub Cherise, Semi Soja Chuni Chere, Suso Shin me Madub Chis, or this I am ever Madub Chis. Nimbe chodan dewa nan doba dajan tonchiros, whatever the Siguna, Sawa the Yamdo.
Yeah. So here we respond to this assertion that it follows that it is not the case that faults are unsuitable to be eliminated because the reason is unproven. So it is not established, we would respond, that the faults of body, speech, and mind are not something suitable to be removed because they are suitable to be removed. So here, it follows that this is so because we have seen through authority that when they come into contact with the antidote, the wisdom realizing no self, they are utterly removed. So here, one is able to establish through reasoning and actually through direct perception that when we grasp at such an autonomous, really truly existent self, all of the faults arise from that. And so when one is able to realize, to recognize that such a self doesn't exist, but is rather something that is merely designated on the basis of the aggregates, one is able to eliminate the kind of faults that arise from that grasping at a self. This is something that can be done in stages, and we can see that they can be removed. And not only just that these faults can be removed, but that they can be extricated from their roots such that it is impossible for them to arise again. So we can establish this through our own direct experience. For example, by seeing the faults of anger, by recognizing how destructive anger is, and seeing the benefits of patience, someone is able to, over time, reduce their anger. We can see in our own mind stream, when we have worked at this, we can see that we can reduce those kinds of afflictions. And this is something that we can establish through our own experience. And it's not just that we are able to temporarily make those less and less, but rather if one has the proper antidote, we can actually remove those from their root. And so here, the root verse for this is then that if you say that stains cannot be eliminated because they are natural to living beings, like form, etc., to a pot, we reply, it is not the case because the reason is unproven. It's unproven that these are natural to sentient beings because we have seen that when they come into contact with the antidote, they are removed. So this is something where we are able to establish that this, when our afflictions come into contact with the antidote, they can be removed.
Oh, yeah. Tayan di shekdwa. Niba chungse den dogba yungures kondurabshina. Kondul kendi tone out I will do some co naked dog siri. Yashima yang ko kendi sonsona. Kendi Sheba cometa tende some shitama the young man kondu saungurwa. Chidan ko niba chasola sobateda. In do naked doja ten and doba yungumares. Chungse doja. Dene Lauren Chungse doja ten do misiba Sheba ten to doyo mares. Niba rishi seja sergi sawashin dollar dogo se chagdana sobe nyamutu kanga kyendu kanga negap chiringa ti samluristan doye sigre se done yanga ko suke ngure se sergi sawashin dose mendra jitan sertu shuna shi ko ti chandu do nya medin niba ma nyung chasuna kongema ne shi tagbo ranglo su tagbo chandu ro ho dinashi kapkalia tos chakso mebe chagre kondu ngaje chado mebe chado yang chimanken de chitsanso yake ngure sigore o shenas de debati chiguna.
So then the next point is disposing of the objection that even if our faults can be removed a little, it is impossible that they be thoroughly removed. So someone might think, well, okay, even if our faults can be eliminated for a little while, like say thinking about the faults of anger and the benefits of patience, we can maybe reduce that anger for a while, but it's going to come back again. So even if the faults have been eliminated for a while, they can return like the solidity of gold that has been melted. So here, this is something where the opponent is thinking, well, our faults, they can be averted temporarily, but it's not as though they are averted in a permanent kind of a way, in that they could arise again. Like how, if you say melt gold, you will have molten gold for a while, but when it cools, again, you're going to have that solid gold. So, in the same way, one would say that, well, maybe we won't have the arising of anger, the proper conditions won't be met for a while, but that is something that will come about again.
Oh, yeah. That tell Ralupa, the Genshudo. Never nimble top the number and gash, Saba Nese. Genshasola soba to the Nimble Pamito soba to the top G, number and gash, Saba Nese. Sergei Sawa Shindo, or Tameto on the Tanzimpa, your shit, and each other said to the share, and it Sergei Sawa Nashi, and just so do you to the Maris and Gora. Niba Nibut of the number and gashi, Sabanis, Nibutameto with us, came Chunju Chenis, gas on Yaya, she would take Kessigra. Tandako never guess a Zawa Koran to connect you to Chessian, Tizawa de Tameto Bashira, you come. Pia yurimbu kom nang musum du tone. Nima nga sam nga shukin drona dena sana yaga chuna duga chuna ti shukshimbu tegora. Ta tanda drona dena chi yaga da duga kari chuna tongba di trench dro tegordo. O ti indu tinde chen nga du ti tempo shibu cha duga mato. Nima ken shunchung chigi yangya ga yangya chu loya tinde maru sungora. Niba nimbe to je number gashi seba ne serge sawa shindo larian kewa mebarta yangja su kin doyong marese. Nenju tarichin be semlase. Ngari chakdan gi shamadu gyur nyomo gi shamadu gyur dangzi gi shamadu gyur debe negab tile pen done. Tadanda Nama soso semji wangdu gyur semde chakdan da dangzi gi shamadu gyur ne ti wangdu doyade ta mebachare ta soso semde so wang gyube sundo soso 착당기 상황도 두고 말해 당신이 상황도 두고 말해 소소파 착당을 원규시 매버서 텐데시를 되라 nenju tarshi ba ngar ji ne ka butende mar nge ma na shi ma de so ra ta gom ne nenju nge me ne ka pe jur ne be ne ba shembo tarshi ba ta shembo re ne ko tarshi so ra o tinde ne ka yu go re te so da lar do ye de yung ma re so go do sa je do ba memba ta nenju tarshi be semla Tami Tokbe Shira Dredo maybe shows. Nima Tangzi, you went the Tami Tokbe Shira, Meva Duatende Yomare. Said the Shuni Metanje, Chunashi Chaya, may have shot in the Shake Yomare, Meta to Yuvas Nashi, Tami Tokbe Lo de Kadu in a Yura. Or you use the tissue of detail or a tissue you do that Tangzi the Chana de Ketu Mare Solara. Te Dani. Tami to shirab deldo maybe shir. Te tani jengang chidun gyueshes. Sim de Tami to bala soba o te rangshin to rangshin ki kongang chi ting rangshin gyudu de yoresa. Te tani jengang chidun gyueshes. Tarangi rangshin tengechi. Te rantu tengechi atore. Nechi lona nejan dogbe ngeba meba tas. Neba chenge den do sona. Yan nöche de ngema na shi su dogba ngeba yo ma re chara tende yo ma kashe tende yo ma do kashe ya paji nöche du chu dogi me tende yo re se kares na shing de jin me ra na me ta so na shing de tawa re du ra ko te tele re du ra ta ya me ma dan se ne ko ngeme shing de tawa de chu ra lo je yo ma do shing de ji to de chi so na ta me ma dan ya ko ngema na shi shing chu so e ke yo ma ra 어디서도 그 창맞는데 말해서 뇌지 지기 봐야 무슨 뇌선에 주 뇌지 매너를 도도로 해봐요 말해서 뇌지로나 뇌전도 뭐 내가 매발타 매로자 타와 신도 면도 바신 베스스 어디버도 지구나 사와디디라 내가 넘버는 각반에 사신 라야 깨매데세 대다 니겐 델메다세 타와 신도 망이 칠세 내가 넘버는 각반에 Sergei Sawa Larke was in the Kea Yomarese. Tedani Demeses, Tamido Beshirab, Lord, Tamido Beshirab, Getani to June, Tedan Dawame to Negores. Saudi. Tawashin do Mangi so Tibato Chiguna. Those mountains
So,
are.
then our own system's response to this, the opponents claiming that, okay, even if the faults are eliminated for a while, they can return, like melted gold becoming solid again. Our own system responds to that by saying that when the faults are stopped and eliminated by the power of the antidote, it follows that they will not arise again, as does the solidity of melted gold, because a mind that is in a completely transformed state is not separate from the wisdom realizing no self. And by the fact that that wisdom has become one nature with the self nature of that transformed mind. So here, our own system again responds with, well, if one develops this wisdom realizing selflessness, and based upon that realization, then engages in meditation, habituating for a long time, one is able to attain what is called a completely transformed state, wherein that is something that is irreversible. The kind of wisdom realizing selflessness has become such that these faults that we once had cannot arise again. So we can actually come to a state through the habituation of the wisdom realizing selflessness, wherein that self-grasping is unable to arise again. It's a completely transformed state, that such that we are not able to come under the control of that self-grasping or under the control of our attachment and anger and so forth. So this is something that is an extremely powerful kind of ability, again, developed through habituation over time. So we make effort developing this wisdom, realizing selflessness, such that it becomes in the nature of mind. It becomes the self nature of that transformed mind, such that it's not even possible to give rise to self-grasping again, because one has made such a fundamental change. One is actually like integrated into the nature of mind, this wisdom realizing selflessness. So although there are examples, as the opponent claims, wherein we can see that transformations are reversible. You melt gold, it can again become solid. We also have those kinds of transformations that are irreversible. So if we, for example, it follows that there is no certainty that when the destroyer is removed, what has been damaged will return, because your example is uncertain, as shown by our counter example. Even when fire is removed, it does not follow that ashes will revert to wood. So there are some kinds of irreversible changes. When, say, we burn a piece of wood, we can't, by, say, burning it again, make it back into solid wood. It has become ashes, and that is irreversible. And so too, it is asserted with this wisdom realizing selflessness. When it has been, when it has become such that it is in the self nature of that transformed mind, self grasping can no longer arise. As the root verse reads, when the faults are stopped, they will not arise again, as does the solidity of molten gold, because the mind without faults is not separate from the self nature of the antidote, and the example is uncertain, as ashes will not revert to wood.
Oh, yeah. Taniba Yandi, Niba Tangzi, Sibe Tower to Basso, Tatun Zimbadita, Siba Koag, Tower de Teres, Yanga to Gudwa, and Tangzi Niba Gunji Sawa, Nyamola Soba Chaso, Sawade. Tangzi de Tangzi Mabambar, Tabshe Komja Sibala to a Missiba shed, Subset Nidua. Tatambu Tangzi Niba Gunji Sawa in Batubatulini, Tungi Sawa Tangzi Dere. Tungi Tungi Zawa, Tungi Tanzere, Nyamugi Zawe Tanzere, Stabini, the Wata Tambudra. Tungi Kunji Zawa, Tatun Zimbadi, Tungi Kunji Zawa in Batangua. Sosegyo Tameba Kanshitela and Church, Sosegyo Chidangi Metusora, Sosegyo Tameba Kanshila and Church. She Tado Tada Medeve, Session Javan Yude, 2000 Kaduina, Yagachuna, Tugachuna, Kaduina, Ganzi Orno, Nanga, some Rawe Ganzimbe, some Ludu 2000, Tada Medeve, Session, not Tala Session, Tala Shemba, Javan Yude. Kansagi Tado Tonshi Shembeshers, nga samsa kansa rawe ta do yubaji thon tele ani shencha yordo ta de chipige tunge kaya me gwa tawa kari ne kongen ripe shebo sabso je songi chego ya sore tongo yordo o tende to ko tawa tuwe da tunge se da tilia chagda la sokba nyemo kanga ke chojo reche shiro chi sukje yongo yordo nga shi ta da medewar se shen ke war gyurde kansa ke ta do thong shi shimbe shir kansa rangi te rawe ta do shenje ne rawe ta tilia ko shenja yore dena se ta ke tawa la se bar gyurde se te yede san da ke tawa so so yaga yonya chine tawa de se gro tunge de bishine mende ba kegra thowa kegra o tende kegre se ta ke tawa la se bar gyurde se ta da mende or shimbe so se ta da mende or ko ta de tawan de la tunge mende ba chi shibje ran shindu ko sam de ora tende ko ta ke tawa la hagba se tunge de la mende ba la se tunge de tawa la se tawa to ba la se ora tunge de tawa la se so de mena samje telia ya sabake yordo ta da mende or shimbe so Tedana onso dagi wala yebe kyona dibarchis tal tewa kuyuna tewe chagende de sobo debo kuyore tene kanga wang buchama yabuch kuyordo yende sosula tawara betenge shitu zu kanga le shinja yongora ne tedana onso miwana wa chama luan so tezu kanga sura ene te long ja so da te ro re ja sa ya to ko soba tezu kanga shinja yongora tena wanso dagi wala yebe kyona dibarchis o tezulia kyon dibshin tunge jibe shiche kyon de pase tunge de travel sebe koneti mebsoya mebe yonde de tonsona te dele yonso sebe kone yonde de tande yonete ya tele lagba yon tawshi chiyo no tagi dewala sebe so o tezu kanga yungures kare sudu nga sam tawan dele tunge mede badbe shibuji ge chimbuji sin chairo and tag dawala se so de teve chagin to be da tunge me ya da ti chagin le chagwa ke me de batele ya to ke la so ba te ga so de de ora ti ba do chi juna ya
So then we turn to, again, establishing or proving that self-grasping is the root of craving. So here, this is divided into showing that self-grasping is the root of all fault, and then the impossibility of being freed from samsaric existence when one accustomates other methods without abandoning self-grasping. And so that's the first of those is divided into showing that self-grasping is the root, the cause of all suffering, and showing that it is the root or cause of all defilements. And so here again, in someone who is an ordinary person, a common individual, saying I will entail the arising of desire for the permanent, non-separation from the self, because they see a self of persons and desire it. So it is based upon our sense of an I, or sense of there being some sort of like autonomous, independent, real self, that when we want something good for that self, we're going to have attachment, and we have aversion towards that which is unwanted. So it is the nature, when one is grasping at a self, to want to have happiness for that self and want to avoid any kind of suffering for that self. So if that is asserted, that because they see a self of persons and desire it, we have this craving, this desire for a self, then it follows that they will crave the happiness of the self, since they desire not to be separated from the self. So there's this craving for a self, and there's the desire to have happiness for that self. Since that is the case, the craving hides from the sense faculties, etc., the flaws that exist in what pertains to the self. So when they see the good qualities of the non-existent self, it follows that they utterly crave them, and since they crave the happiness of the self. So again, we are all in this situation when we have craving or desire for a self. Then there's this need, a craving for this sort of good, wanting good things and wanting to avoid anything that is unpleasant. And so, in this way, when we hold to such a self, this then becomes the basis of our craving for what pertains to the self. So we see things as being good or beneficial and crave and want those, and want to sort of, we have craving for avoiding suffering as well. So this is the kind of way in which craving arises from this seeing of a self.
Oh yeah. Talk about doing that. What it's all doing him do love Senator. Can she talk on Delanese? So secure can she now him do round out on Telanera? Now she thought to Shember use. Now she to need that and Medre Seba than Shembaki Grace, Seba the Shemba Shabaki Grace. Shembe tell us a unit target the all seven Grace. Seba Yubewange, and it give like you to find Diberche. So you and then to talk to you to talk about the Shenja Kitty young in a till a log with your Seba Grace. You and then to a young Sepa. So what is election?
So then, to read the root verse for this, it says, in someone ordinary, an ordinary individual, saying I will entail desire for the permanent, or they have, we constantly have this kind of desire for I, and for they see a self. Um, so then we turn to, they will crave happiness since they desire the self, and the craving will hide the flaws in the self. When they see the good qualities of the self, they utterly crave them, and saying mine, they seek the accomplishment of that. So again, when we have an ordinary being, they have the sense of I, and that I gives a rise, there's a sense of there being sort of like a permanent self, and then arises craving, desire for that which is beneficial to the self, and a craving to avoid that's non-beneficial.
Oh yeah. Then I say that the Tuchi Lembala Jubar Judes or Tesonza, Cusente Chena I say Tag Chite Tuchi de Chayan, Karina Tezoyada, between Chato say that Tindel Besuch and Sagwar Sebecon and Judu, Besuch, Chaval and Judes and Gora. Then I say that the Tuchi Lembala Jubar Jude. Tashingamatis, Tuche Lembalan Juba Jude, one so dagi wala yube kyon and diberche, maybe you and then tove, you also seven jueces. The Tashingamas you tell the Tashi Tawata, the Chidishidua. Then I want so dagi wala yube kyon and diberche, you and then tove, you also seven jura taral said, what the talacos you are a Tujidilla. Then I say that the Tuche Lembalan Juba Jude. One so dagi wala yube kyona dibarche, maybe you and then towe, you also say but UHS, Kusenti Gudwa. Say but tena koa koa and you this hotena, and then koa the Korgi or rest, they want to koa and you de. Tenekara koa and you de. Tena koa and you de say. Tala chakba change sosuke in beaches. Tala chakba unani, Tawa Yungri Chagnaguangi, Kidigile Sagri Tewangi, Leguangi, and it was Angelian to go to any course integration with sosuke in beaches. Chabar Tala Ngumber Chakba Chunse, Yamabamba Tiseto, Kora Kovacher. Tangziche Tala Ya Shinja Yuna, Tagi Tewa to Vieta, Tungisea, Tilko Shinja Shukshimbushani, Bezuchigra. Titandaleko less agra some samlutangre, Kaneke Shagre, Luigi Chebache, Padusu Javre, Kanga Tingatunam Yahakura Sosa. Sadanga Legatisco, Tilco, Meti, Mevasai, Nazukanga Jude, or a part of Sundo, Titandalia, Kaneke, Sembe Samlutan, and Luigi Cholam Tone, Tizukanga less agro, take it less about ten, and yes, on time, tender call Kogiora. What did you do?
So here then again, looking at the beginning with the line saying mine, they seek accomplishment of that. So thus saying mine, they will engage in seeking accomplishment of that self because of the prior consequence that they crave the good qualities of the self. So it is then an ordinary being because they have they will seek accomplishment of that self because they have this craving of the good qualities of the self. So ordinary sentient beings circle in samsara because they are therefore an ordinary being attached to a self. So it is out of this attachment to a self, this craving for a self, and seeing the good qualities of that, that then causes sentient beings to cycle in samsara. We are trying always, we have this natural desire to accomplish the sort of conducive conditions for the self, to remove any sort of obstacles for that self. So here it says then, it follows that this reason pervades because even if there is a little manifest attachment to a self, they will circle in samsara as long as they have not abandoned that manifest attachment to self. So, for as long as we have this kind of attachment, this craving for a self, we are going to then engage in various actions with our body, speech, and mind, motivated by that attachment to a self. So all of the sort of physical activities that we engage in, the efforts that we make, will be towards trying to benefit or accomplish the desires of that self. And all of the way that we speak to others, the way that we think and act, will be colored by that kind of attachment to ourself. So as long as we have that kind of craving for a self, all of our actions, all of our efforts will be directed toward that kind of attachment, or driven by that sort of manifest attachment. And that then causes us to circle in samsara.
Oh, yeah. It's all the election. It's all the governors. Oh, yeah. Sebe so the Kashita don't tell any Ashita to Shimba, Shimba tell us a great Sebe Kunan. You dare to me, young Seba. I should the Trujile. Tena Dala went Shabbat to sit on the quadro, Timado. Somebody loves her matter again. So I can't sit down, don't tell any Ashita to Shimba to take down those one. Now, Ashita, Shimba Sebe, Shimba Sela, Seba, Javala Seba. Sebe Kuna Dribas, you dare to young Shabbat, Tamati Saudera. Tatanda Zawade Ngai to Trupchi Lens, Ngai Tele Chagin to Vechido, Sebe Kone Lembal Jugres. Tena Dala Mo Shaba to sit on the quadru, Tena Dala Shaba, Machumba to sito, and it Dala Chagbe Yuto to Tubeta, Mendebet say at Daliani, Tapsi to Lesa Yordo. You sit on Debado Quaco, it's our the Chiguna.
So then, looking at the root verses related to this, we had gone through the earlier part of this. And so again, in someone ordinary, saying I will entail desire for the permanent, for they see a self. They will crave happiness since they desire the self. And then the craving will hide the flaws in the self. When they see the good qualities of the self, they utterly crave them. And saying mine, they seek accomplishment of that. So as long as one has the sense of mine, the sense of the self, and then the kind of mine and wishing to accomplish that, thus they will circle in samsara as long as there is manifest attachment to the self. So in this way, when we have this kind of manifest attachment to the self, one is going to want to accomplish the happiness of that I, that and avoid the suffering of that I. So as long as one has that, one will continue to cycle within samsara.
Oh, yeah, Taran look pa Shandelia Tanda. Genduni Dangdo, Tela, there is Shandela, Shande, Tataba Mawa Tozulia, Tanzipa Magone Tarwa Togu Tozulia. Tela, there is Shande, Namla, Kune Yomoba, Tan Namjana, Tembengenduni, US, Gavani dos, Dakara, Kune Yomo, La Tempest Yomogi. Chosi, the Kune Yamu Chok Tembasa. Namjangi Chos, the Keva Lake Satellite Namjangi Chos. Tela dere shende namla kune nyomo bada namjang la tembe gendu ni yodese gendu tambo ne se gendu tambo de kares na kune nyomo la tembe gendu shindose kera khore ni dene kasa koe kichi dube tunge kyun cheban de bada kera ge nyomo be cho ge ro koe Kewada Chiwala Soba to do Tunge to the Gunchen, Tarwa Toya Yoshi killing it to Archer. The Namjarawa, Koye Kishi Dube, Tunge Guncheba de Tarbada Tendesiora, the Namja number Chawa de Legbe Shadi or number Chawa, tell Gavandus, take killing to Askera. Tunge Guncheba de Bada, the dog is our de. 다다 대자와 용사데 다다 조 지소 시르바이나 지소게 이제 정말 지으시고도 제바보디 지소를 시작하라 가셔게네 뒤가서라 원줄라 소바 하도도 제바볼 시작하라 근데 대다게 자와 다다 지소라 소바 딱바르 되방게디야 대소가 딱바인 시고라 다 딱바인 시 아니 코엔 니치 탐제 제바부 지소 인사로 가셔게네 삼제게 제바보데 아니 원주 첨불에서 하이 릭텐데 위에서라 가사게 하이 릭텐데 대주 강가 지고라서 대주 강가 딱바인 시고라 통만 매번에 코라 위에서 딱바체 텐데 켈링게 얼노 다다 조라서 바 딱바 되반 게데 규말로바 데분 도바 메시지 딱바 규디 로기 매나 데분 도바 시그마와 케라 규도 강가 메네 치조데 또 남멜로에 매버로 건조 아니 치조다 원줄라 소바트 딱바세 또 딱도 내내버래 아니 코아코지 규 따라 소바트 또 딱도 내내버이네 인데부디 로에 연구 마르와 매버샤지 연구 마르 연구레서라 규말로바 데분 도바 메시지에서 딱뱅고부 뒤나면 독반배도 계란 되베 딱뱅고부 다다 지초다 아니 지탱기 제바볼라 소바트도 강가데 나면 독반배베서 균 독반배나 균의주 찾아 산들은 대부분 너의 연구 말했어 티 남장라 땜뱅게도 들어와 말에 꾸네 요mol에 땜뱅게도 들어와 단 남장라 땜뱅게도 세들 오마데 남장라 땜뱅게도 네 동해지 풍부 각베 타르바토버 되바다 오데 동해지 풍부된 가네 타르바토베 요시 남장시라 디 켈링게 도와서 타르바토베 요데 가사게 다 리베 투반 게데서 냐 가사게 다 요시 딱바치고 라마마 예스테 리과게 투고 도와서 가사게 당지 요나 코에 동에 멘드신도 내지 케베서 가사 딱바 라마마 친 남중간조 삼번에 시요나 이 삼로데 데데그와 대삼로도 대대근에는 동해 깨운 그래서라 간사게 당제에는 코에 동해 면도신도 깨베 처리세 디니니 되지 그네 되도 그네 녀모 처를 때베 겐두 식사 남자를 때베 겐두니도가 뜻이구나.
So here, then, in our own system, Gelbajay is saying that other schools are guilty of two contradictions based on their discussion of defilements and purification. So here, this is the kinds of contradictions that occur for those who assert that we don't need to abandon self-grasping in order to be liberated from samsara, or those that assert that there is some kind of a permanent a self. And so here there are two sort of contradictions or faults that occur, one pertaining to the side of affliction or the defilement, and then one pertaining to the side of purification. So again, this is regarding a number of different schools, but it says the first contradiction. It is contradictory to assert, on the one hand, that the continuum of suffering that comprises birth and death in samsara is interruptible, and to assert, on the other hand, that the root of those sufferings is a permanent self or principle. Because without the cause being absent, it is impossible that the result be removed, and it is impossible that a permanent entity ever be absent. So there are those who assert, with regard to the side of affliction or delusion, that the being that is experiencing birth and death and so forth in samsara is somehow permanent, or that there is like a permanent principle, a general sort of principle underlying all phenomenon. This is the idea of the sort of the Thabkhe view. Or there are those that assert that there's some sort of a permanent creator, and that these things are beginningless, like this a permanent self being beginningless, or whatever principle or creator God it may be. And so, if you have such a permanent thing, then it is contradictory to assert that there could be any sort of removal of that, and therefore it's impossible that there be a kind of result that come about from that. So if you can't avert the cause, if you can't remove the cause, then how can you attain a particular result? So if there's no way to remove the cause of our suffering because it is something that's just permanent, then it's contradictory to assert that there is liberation. And then on the side of purification, it says the contradiction based on purification. It is contradictory to assert, on the one hand, that one can attain a liberation that is the cessation of the suffering aggregates, and to prove by reasoning, on the other hand, that there exists a self of persons. Because when one grasps at a self of persons, one forcefully generates the undesirable suffering of samsara. So here, again, when it comes to the side of purification, it is contradictory to assert that there is some sort of permanent self, and that it could somehow then be possible to be liberated or attain a cessation of those suffering aggregates if such a self were to exist.
Oh yeah, that is. That the Tangzi the Nyomo Kunji Tower Temple Gudwa. Tanda Tangzi the Tunge Kunji Tower Temple Chinsara. That Tangzi Nyomo Kunji Tower Temple. That Zimbayane Nyomo Kanga Chigre. So Deo Denny Sujan Gira, De Sujan. Chaso Niba Tamjan Zonartas. So Deliani Chaso. Doja Kondunga Gela Sobekan Samatamje Zonartas Gara. 다른 짐바 총세 야마냐 바이버상가 삼상게 간지 라와 짐바디 총세 야마냐 바 뒤균도 요바나 신상기 요레스고라 캬바탈세 간지도 요나 메니 차소니 바 도사 컨트롤서 바 케베 캬브그레세 캬바타 대요나 셴도 셰바 조스 나 삼상게 간지도 요나 나데 타완돌라 동에 메드베라 신상기 나치 나 삼상기 라와치 요나 아니 텔레 셴 세세 야 라와치 셴도 집바디 용구레세 제요나 셴도 셰바 중세 텔레 타셴 테테요나니 나 네초스야 소소 초라부 직지 셴들이야 셴 소소 메가 개초레치 텔레아니 셴지 초시 지라 셴초시 지라 테니 타 초마부티라 소소 Nangmida Timati Chane Chonga Rangcho Chichi. Ya Pajo de Kabdi Changi, Nimechi Tares, Tande Tares, Mahoban Yondo Kavaris, Kabdi Chasa Chor of Shenda, Shangi Chor of Chicha. Ne Chagdaniki, Tiwangene, Talia Sagro. So they want to get to Geshe at Tito the Pajo de Tal Kabdi Chayada, or Tindesene, Lesage Quacoyodo. Tele Shendo Sheba Jola Tele Shen Oniji or the Das Rawa Oniji Trubashi. Shens the Oniji Trubashi, Ranshinji round the Trubashi, some Koyara. The one Shena Nas the Rawa Kevio Marto. Shens the Rawa Chio Mar Tudure, Puriturina Shire. Around the Samlin Nalangas, the Naran Keshe, the Naya, some Nachibure, some Budo. Paso de something the Koran Keshe, Nazo Kesho at Chutangra. Paso de some Nangansos, the Contra Keshe, Nazo Kesho Tangra. Young Adangas, young Azos, you got the Puriturina Shire. Nase at the Congo 7, Nombo de Sutan, Nombo de some Sebo de Sutan, Sebo de Samgira. So so nga se rawa to ba chi no ode nga re da sanga chi bul ken zo ka nga sam go de te sam gi maro sam nga ra sam go phajo de ko ra nga sam ge to phar chu na se re cha ra lamri kap so go ba da da shen se de nga se do rang rawa chi da shen do rawa chi sam ge war de tende yo ma re se phajo de nga sam ko ra nga sam ge war nga zo shen sam ge war nga zo nga sam phajo de shen sam ge war phajo de de koran til yo be re de churi ni se ra phajo se phajo sha ra phajo de de kon nga zo churi de kon phajo de pa sha ra sa ko tende ge yo ma de ne rawa do sho chi be sam lo ko ane tak so da shen zo chulu da miri da lungba da ka ga cho de nga zo jambul to de do ngusum to de do chao shen che de chao de chi chi ta ti kan do ta ti kan so so ni ba me na ni ba yo ge de nyam do de do ko do ta kon jambul shi de ra ka so da tende chak da me cha nga ra nga zo pa cha na she na she kera ke shen bo de kera cho de ge shen bo de ge do se kera ge de wa du ya ta ka nge se de kera kar che na de re ina ti ton da le mi shen da cha wa che so ma ti ma chen de do koran zo ya go yo ya ka re yo na ta shi se mi shen da ne ba ma chen shen da koran zo ya go yo che shen da ne ba ma chen ne ko ka ga ya go ro ale phe ma do na te yo ma ra nga zo ya bo yo go nga zo ya bo do ko zo 전에 또 고고 땅고 투주다나 되게 저 사샤고 서 롱바치게 저 사야요래 로 현대 차도 제요래 다디 셔모마 다디소 다유나네 샹도시 다셔살은 준다 다세드라 도도르다 텔레셰 ngo니지 리다 차소소로 체벨레 란쇼 젠제 차바다 셴쇼라 다웨 차단 되다 데다다 규용소 대화를 교회에서서 어디라 다데 저와데 디냠도 랍션에오도 다유 나네 셴도 시레세 라 다유 나네 셴도 시 다셴 챌린지다다 딱쇼데 셴조니 초마부티라 모네시네 다데스 미디제 데다다네 용들레 녀바로 데다다데 용선데 코네 아니 시게 시게 강가데 Nyamo Kangada, Chagdan Kangada, Sochibada, Machin Balam Kanga, Teletany Go, Resungara. Oh, did you do now?
So here, then we turn second to showing that this self-grasping is the root of all of our afflictions, as we've just shown that it is the root of all of our suffering. And so here it says, then it follows that self-grasping is the source of attachment and all faults. Because if there is even a little self-grasping, the faults will not be undermined. It follows that this reason pervades because when there is self-grasping, there occurs the recognition of other. So here, when we have a situation where this grasping at a self, this idea of some sort of autonomous, independent self has not been eliminated, then you're going to hold strongly to this idea of I. And when we hold to this sense of an I, we're then going to distinguish that from others. So you hold those, there's like a sense of being on my side, and those are on the other. And so when we have the sort of recognition of self or grasping at a self, then there occurs the recognition of other. So from that, one analyzes out separate categories and parts having the nature of self and other. And from that, one's mind stream will come into contact with the attachment and anger that respectively are grasping at and attached to one's own interests, and have anger toward the interests of others, from which attitudes all faults arise. So here, when we have this sense of self, we're going to then distinguish between self and other. And when we then engage in that kind of distinction, we think of my side, my family, my friends, my country, and so forth. And then there's those others that are on that side. And rather than from that kind of recognition of self and other, grasping at the self and then identifying an other, one gives rise to the various afflictions of attachment and hatred and so forth. So attachment towards one's own side, and sort of aversion towards ones that one has labeled as being an enemy and so forth. And so rather than having a sense as they are that these are mutually designated in the way that we see here and there, the sense of self and other is really based upon your perspective. We have this sense that the I is like set up from its own side, and that other is other from its own side, as if there's some sort of autonomy in this self and other, that they really exist in that way, rather than being like a sense of over here and over there. When I am here, this place that I am is here, and that over there is the there. But when you go to the there, that then becomes here, and where you were is there. So we see that this is how it really the self and other exists, is by mutual designation. But yet we look at these kind of categories as being like autonomous, as set up from its own side. That my, and I is sort of this self then is something that exists by its own characteristics or by its own virtue. And then there extends out from this a sense of like, well, my country, my people, my neighborhood, my religion, and so forth. And so from that then comes the sense of holding this I and the one's own side as being more important, and sort of having contempt for looking down upon the needs of others. Now here, when it comes to making this kind of recognition between self and other, we could say, you know, it's okay if you say hold your people or your country to be important. Those are sort of things that are important. But the problem comes when you then are harming others. So if you're able to take care of your own needs and work for the benefit of people based upon this grasping or this sense of an I or sense of a collective my side, well, as long as we are not harming others, even if we are not able to benefit them, then that's okay. But generally, when we have that kind of sense of I, mine, my side, and another side, one is going to get into this kind of all of these various afflictions that are connected with that. And from that comes then, say, cheating others and stealing from them and doing those negative actions that, again, are propelling us within samsara. So here, from that, one's mind stream will come into contact with the attachment and anger that respectively are grasping at and attached to one's own interests, and have anger toward the interests of others, from which attitudes all faults arise. So here, to read the root verse of this, that's often quoted, self-grasping is the source of all faults. When there is self, there is the recognition of other. From the parts, self and other, one will come into contact with the attitudes of grasping and anger, from which all faults arise. So long as one has that sense of the I and mine, we engage in various afflictive emotions, and those afflictions then in turn lead us to engage in actions like killing and stealing and so forth, thus perpetuating samsara.
Oh, yeah, that is it. Oh, yeah.
So we'll stop there for today, as I think the time is up.
Thank you so much, Geshe Thabkhe, and
Oh,
also
yeah. Oh, welcome.
yeah. Very, very wonderful teachings. Thank you so much, and we have them again tomorrow. So we will.
Oh, yeah. See you again tomorrow.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful.